Hello everybody, and welcome to Introduction to Korean Studies. Today we are going to look at the Korean War, and as we have done in previous weeks and with previous topics, what we're going to do today is really try to examine common perceptions of the Korean War, either as is commonly taught in textbooks or um, commonly depicted in the media and in film. And then we're going to really explore what these meanings are and how they affect and influence our perceptions of not only South Korea but also North Korea and the general, I guess, geopolitics of the region and relations between both North and South Korea. All right, so by going over briefly the historical background to the Korean War, in 1945, Japan surrenders at the end of World War II, thereby ending the war. But this also means that Korea is able to gain its independence along with the other colonies of Japan. So when Japan surrenders on August 15th, 1945, August 15th now being a national holiday in Korea, the Liberation Day, what we have a very diverse population in Korea. So because of the different colonial experiences that the Korean population went through, there's really a great range of people and experiences that we see that remain after the Japanese surrender. So, for example, there are landlords who own a lot amount of land and who did quite well for themselves, and then there are very poor tenant farmers who had difficulties with just getting by or paying rent. We have capitalists and white-collar professionals, and on the other end there are factory wage workers and landless peasants. So there's really quite a range of people and experiences at the end of the colonial period. And so one of the key issues becomes, how do we prepare for establishing an independent Korean government and incorporate all of these different people? So the first thing that the Koreans do is they establish the Committee for Preparation of Korean Independence. And this committee, it incorporates figures on the political left and figures on the political right and everybody in between. So it really was a true attempt at a coalition government to include everybody. And this committee called for unity, it called for nonviolence, and it eventually turns into a temporary peacekeeping organization. But they are really the ones who incorporate the main political figures of the time and are working towards establishing an independent Korean government. And with the establishment of the CPKI, all across the country there are small local branches in different regions of the country that are set up. And they are local branches of the CPKI called People's Committees. And within about 2 weeks after liberation, about 145 of these People's Committees have been set up across the country. And these People's Committees, they included youth groups and student groups and women's groups and workers groups and farmers groups and intellectuals and just all different kinds of people, because this was really the first time that the general population had an opportunity to participate in the political process. And so it was really quite an exciting time for Koreans, and people were enthusiastic about participating. And so about 145 of these people's committees were established throughout the country. And so the CPKI said, all right, everybody elect a representative of your committee and then send your representative up to Seoul, and we will hold a general convention, which they did. And at that convention, they decided to establish the government, which was called the Korean People's Republic. So the Korean People's Republic was established on September 6, 1945. This is, shortly after, about 3 weeks after liberation from Japanese colonial rule. One of the issues, though, was that there was quite a bit of interest on the part of the Russians or the Soviets and the Americans in terms of how a newly independent Korea was going to develop and in which direction it was going to go. So the Russians had historically an interest in Korea, beginning in the 19th century with the Russian consolidation of their empire and occupying this area up here and sharing a border, becoming coterminous with Korea. They had generally always had an interest in what was going on in Korea and had made several attempts to set up either ports or different trading posts on the Korean Peninsula. So knowing this, the Americans understood that the Russians would want to be involved, they would have to be involved, and that they would only agree to a multilateral administration. And so the United States, because their policies had changed at this point, and this is because the United States, which had initially not wanted to get involved in the war, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, their Pacific area, the Pacific part of the United States, was exposed as vulnerable. And so the United States shifted their policy at this point, and they felt that the security of America depended on the security of the Pacific. And after 1945, this included the security of Korea. So in order for the United States and the Pacific to be secure, to be safe, then the United States needed to secure Korea as well. And so because they understood that the Russians would want to be involved, they proposed what is called trusteeship policy. And trusteeship is this idea that the Koreans are not ready for establishing an independent government yet, and that they needed to be guided along by a bigger, more powerful, more experienced government, namely the Soviets and the Americans. And so they say, okay, we are going to help you to set up your government, and as a result of this, the United States decides to send in 25,000 American soldiers to the southern part of the peninsula, and the Soviets send in soldiers to the northern part of the peninsula. And this really sets up the scene for Cold War, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. But as you can imagine, the Koreans were very resentful of the implication that they were not ready to establish their own government, because in fact they had established their government, as I just mentioned, the Korean People's Republic. And so they felt like, well, we're fine, we're good, we have a handle on things, and we've just established our own government, so we don't really need your help. But this was something that the United States and the Soviet Union insisted on. And so what's interesting then is to keep in mind at this point is that while United States and the Soviet Union agree that, okay, we're going to split the country at the 38th parallel, and the Soviet Union will take the northern half and the Americans will take the southern half. This was extremely arbitrary. Um, this was, roughly the midpoint of the peninsula, and for many Koreans, this was just kind of puzzling because um, they did not consider themselves to be North Koreans or South Koreans. This kind of an identity formation doesn't come until later. But we're all Korean. We're all Korean. This is Korea. Korea had been the whole peninsula as one country for hundreds and hundreds of years. So there wasn't a real understanding or concept of this division. But this was something that was imposed upon Korea by these outside powers. And then by the time we get to 1948, so tensions increase between the Soviet Union and the United States as a result of the Cold War. And so the United States says, they approach the United Nations and say, we need to sponsor elections so that the South can establish a stable government and that they can proceed forward. So the United Nations, then they agree to this, and so in May of 1948, UN-backed elections are held in the South, with Syngman Rhee elected as the first president of the Republic of Korea, and Pyongyang protests this. They say, by what right does the United Nations have to come into our country and to say this is the legitimate government? By what authority does the United Nations have? This is something that we should be able to do on our own. So Pyongyang protested this, and in response, they hold their own elections in August of 1948. So Kim Il-sung is elected as the premier of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and the result is that we have the official establishment of two separate governments, one in the north and one in the south. And this is where we begin to see this this formation of this concept of North Korea, South Korea, North Koreans, South Koreans. So shortly after these elections are concluded, the Soviets withdraw their troops from the north, and the Americans withdraw their troops from the south, and this sets up the scene for war, for civil war. And this is because, if we think about it, Syngman Rhee, the two leaders of North Korea and South Korea, Syngman Rhee and Kim Il-sung, they also did not think of themselves as, I'm only North Korean and you are only South Korean, but they still have this, very much this idea that I'm Korean and this is Korea. And so they had no intention of, in the long run, only ruling over half of a country. They had visions, long-term visions, of unifying the peninsula and eventually becoming the leader of all of Korea. And so there is this tension and conflict along the 38th parallel between the two countries, also because there were leftist guerrillas on Jeju Island who were resistant to the United States military occupation in South Korea and to the Syngman Rhee government, and so they had constantly been fighting against this. And there was also at this point the conclusion of Chinese Civil War with the victory of the Chinese communists, and several Koreans had gone to China to help the Chinese Communist Party, And when the Chinese Civil War was over, they returned to North Korea. And so these are experienced, battle ready soldiers. And so there's a combination of factors, but advisors to Kim Il Sung in the North, they tell Kim Il Sung, hey, listen, we have these, this supplemental army of soldiers who have just come back from China, and if we look at the leftist sympathizers in the southern part of the peninsula, if we attack, then the Koreans on that side, in the south, are going to rise up and join us in this communist revolution. And so, after Kim Il Sung gets support from the Soviet Union in 1950, the North attack, and when they attack Seoul, they're able to take Seoul within 3 days. There's quite a bit of fighting up and down the peninsula. The United Nations, so the United States, they send in troops under the auspices of the United Nations, and they're able to recapture Seoul. And so there's this fighting, and eventually there's a stalemate and about 2 years of negotiations. But overall, the war lasted for 3 years, where millions of Koreans died. A truce was finally signed in July of 1953, but this was not a peace treaty. So technically, North and South Korea are still at a state of war. But if we think of what occurred during this time, during the Korean War, with the chaos of people trying to flee up and down the peninsula, as troops are moving southward and then northward again, and southward and northward, and they're trying to flee these battle scenes, the chaos that ensues as a result of this. And not only do we have widespread destruction and death, but we also have the separation of families and the displacement of a large number of the population. Here is a scene of people who are trying to board a U.S. ship and avoid the conflict. And so what we see is, at this time, although we understand Korea in these terms now as divided between North and South Korea, and here's the 38th parallel, and today we understand North and South Korea with these very well-defined borders. Here we see the Panmunjom, and it's a very clear demarcation between which side is the south and which side is the north. And then all along the DMZ, we have clearly marked and heavily fortified border. And so this is very, very clear and this military demarcation line. But in reality, this is not a straight line like we see on the map here on the 30th parallel. The border between North and South Korea is actually quite jagged. And so this border was not clear, especially after 1945 and even at the conclusion of the Korean War. It was not clear exactly where this border was, and partially this is because it's not a clear line, and we see that it used to be, just kind of like this, where it's not clearly marked off, and you don't know. People didn't know exactly where the 38th parallel was, because if you were Korean and you had lived in Korea all your life, the 38th parallel was not a border that defined anything that you were familiar with. It's not like it's, this is the northern part of Gangwon province, or they didn't Koreans didn't have a real good sense of where exactly the 30th parallel was, or where this border was. And so you would see earlier that people would cross back and forth, either intentionally or inadvertently. They didn't realize that they were crossing over. But that's because that's not how Koreans thought at the time. They just thought, well, this is Korea. This is all one country, and we're Korean. And so there isn't this very sharp separation between the two. If we look at these older pictures, like this says you're now crossing the 38th parallel. Is this heading north or is this heading south? Are they going? It's not clear which direction they're going, and so as you can see, this border does not follow the 38th parallel exactly, and it in fact does not look like this, even though this is how it's portrayed on nearly every map, every contemporary map that we see of North and South Korea. So we see today, in terms of 2020, the year 2020, or in current times, we see that there is a very clear border. It's very clearly marks the separation between North and South Korea, and there's also a very clearly defined identity when it comes to, we are South Korean and you are North Korean, and what exactly that entails. Because whereas earlier on in the period, in the 1950s, it might have been just a matter of geography. So if you lived up here in the north, then that defined you as North Korean, or you lived down here in the south, then that defined you as South Korean. But now it is something much more than that. It is, we see it visually, that North Koreans, they dress differently, their hair is different, the way that they even gather together is different. It's that there are the depictions of North and South Korea are very stark, very, very, there's this very large disparity between the two. Here we see sets of children on the north, obviously exemplifying communists, and on the right, the South Koreans very clearly exemplifying capitalists. In other photographs of the North and the South, here in the North we see agriculture and farming, and in the North it's rather barren, and we see very little food that gets produced, whereas in the South there's an abundance of food and agricultural products, and we have agricultural technology, which also contributes to the prosperity of the harvests. And so we see these very large and sumptuous looking agricultural products. It has this sharp separation between North and South. There's this general belief that there's a big difference in leisure time activities, right? So this on the left we see here in North Korea, and on the right, in South Korea, we have along the Han River, and on the north it's very regimental and more strict, and everybody lines up in rows and tends to wear similar colors, whereas here in the South it's just smaller groups of people, and people are congregating together and enjoying themselves, and it's not strict or regimented in any kind of way. These ideas also have affected North and South Korean entertainment. So whereas In the North, it's about glorifying the North Korean state and the accomplishments of the North Korean state. Entertainment in South Korea tends to be more modeled after Western style types of entertainment. And then also this has a big effect on how nutrition differs, health and nutrition differs in the two Koreas. So as you can see here, the life expectancy of a North Korean is much shorter. They tend to be smaller in height, and malnutrition tends to be a problem in the North, and for pregnant women as well. And so we see it's essentially a tale of two Koreas, where the North has a much smaller population, a much smaller economy, and but the bulk of their spending goes to military spending, and we have a diversion of resources that goes to the military. And so while we have these very clear and well-defined North Korean and South Korean identities today, I'd like to emphasize through this lecture that it was not always this way. And so one of the questions that you should ask yourselves is these constructed identities of North Korea and South Korea, how much of this is real? How much of this is a reflection of reality? How much of this has been constructed for as a result of the Cold War? How much of this has been constructed for nationalist purposes? These are sort of some of the things that I would like us to explore in our discussion. So this concludes our lecture on the Korean War, and I will see you in discussion.